Hey everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm going to be showing off CSS Grid in a React app. Basically, the format for today is to show off CSS Grid, talk about what it is, why it exists, and show just how intuitive and powerful it is to work with. I'm also going to compare it to Flexbox and show how CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox can work together and how they have distinct use cases and are definitely not contradictory. And I will then show off just writing some CSS Grid. We're going to do a basic business site boilerplate kind of layout. And I'll just show you how little code we actually need to write to have Grid just handle our layout for us. So without further ado, I'm just going to create a React app, and I'm going to use Create React App for that because it's the easiest way to get a React app up and running. I just need to pass it a name. I'm going to call my app CSS Grid React because I'm super creative. And while that is pulling down all the stuff and magically putting it all together, I just want to show off the MDN Web Docs. I think this is the best reference for CSS Grid. They've got some very simple examples, but also reference for all the different things you can do with Grid, including the properties and functions. I'll put that in the show notes, as well as CSS Tricks Guide to Grid. CSS Tricks has a much more polished site, of course, a bit more in depth into real world cases. And again, if you want to do something specific with Grid, CSS Tricks might be a place for you to get inspired. So yeah, it looks like our app is ready to run. So I am just going to get that app up and going. Let's open it up in our editor first. And so we've got our app here, and we're just going to be primarily working in the app.js and app.cs files today. Before that, I'm just going to start this app up so the development server is running. That's going to be at localhost 3000 when it's ready. So it's running. I'm going to just hide this terminal here. It'll be running in the background this whole time. And I'm just going to open up these two files that we'll be working in. And I'm going to actually delete everything from here because we don't need any of that. And same for here. Also get rid of the React logo. And so now we've got an empty React app here, basically. I'm going to create a container that's going to contain our grid. So there we go. It's working. I'm going to first just show that it exists by giving it a background color, and then I also need to give it some height. So I'll give it 100 view height and 100 view width. So it takes up the entire viewport here. This should all turn aquamarine. If I target the appropriate class, there we go. So that's up and going. Before we start with the grid, I'm just going to lay out sort of my vision for it. It's again just going to be a boilerplate sort of business site. So up at the top left, I'm going to have like a logo for the business, and then like a header. I'm going to go like 90s style or early 2000s style and have a vertical nav bar on the left there, and then like the main content in the middle. And at the bottom, I'll just have like a footer with some links or something. So this is going to be our design spec for our app, and we'll come back and reference this throughout the session today. All right, so I've got my design. I've set up a container. We're not using Grid yet, but to do that, all I need to do is set display to Grid. And now you can't tell, but this is now using Grid to lay out its children, but it doesn't have any children yet. So let's create those. If we count these items, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to create 5 divs. We'll just call them divs right now. First is going to be a logo. Then we're going to have a header, nav, content, and a footer. And then I'll also change these two to be that. As you can see, as I save that, we got the layout here. And you can see that it is using grid. If I comment this out, this is without grid. This is with grid. So these are being auto spaced, and we'll come back to that in just a second. I'm just going to name these so that we can appropriately target them when we get over there back to the CSS. And call this one footer. Cool. So like I was saying, these are auto spaced. So the way the grid will work is if you don't have a spot explicitly stated for an item, it will just create another row for it and place it there. We could do use grid auto rows and like set these to like 100 pixels. So that means that everything will be laid out on a grid. If there's not an explicit grid area for an item, it will just automatically create a row for it, and that row will be 100 pixels. So as you can see now, that's working by making each one of these divs child divs 100 pixels. But we're not going to do that for our grid since we have this kind of layout. It'll be easier to use what are called grid templates. So I'll first define the rows. And the way that this works is that for the template, you just give the sizes of the rows, and every size that you give is a CSS Grid understands that as another row. So we need 1, 2, 3 rows. So I'm going to say for the logo and header that those are not going to be that big. So I'll make them 100 pixels. For the nav and content, that's going to be sort of the bulk of our page here. So I'm going to make those 500 pixels. And then the footer, let's make that another 100 pixels. So as you can see, it created those rows for us. The first row is 100 pixels. Second row is 500 pixels. And then the third row is 100 pixels. And then these two items, which we hadn't specified a row for them, they don't know where to go. So CSS Grid will use the available spacing left and automatically size those. One nice caveat about that is that if, for instance, this content was more than however much space this is, it will actually fill to that space with grid. So you don't have to worry about overflow that much. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's create the columns, grid template columns. And this works exactly the same way that rows does, but this works for columns. So we need at least 2 columns. That's going to be the simplest for our design here. There are use cases where even if you only have 2 items, you might want more than 2 columns here to sort of space things the way you want. And a lot of designs, especially modern designs, have sort of a layered spacing of items, but we're not going to do that here. We're going to keep it simple. So let's say our first column, which will have the logo and the nav, that'll be our column 1. Let's just make that 100 pixels because that doesn't need to be that wide. And for the content, let's make that like 600 pixels and save that. We can see that that's working. Not exactly as we want yet, but let's start placing the items specifically where we want them in the grid. So to do that, I can do this where, well, first let's change the background color so we can actually see something. Let's use Alice Blue so we can see that that logo is now taking up this whole grid area here. We can say first where the where in the row this item should start filling. So for this, we're going to use the grid number, which is for the row, it's 1 because it's in the first row here. And then it's also in the first column. So let's keep that in mind. So it'll start in 1, and then it will end in 2, right? So it will start in 1 and end when it gets to 2. So it won't take up 2, which is here, but it will stop once it gets there. Then we'll do the same thing for columns. So grid column start, it's in the first column, and then grid column end, and it will also end when it reaches the second column, right? So so that is placed explicitly where we want. We have these explicit rows and columns in our template, and we have placed it explicitly where we want in this first slot here. But this is kind of a lot of code. And one of the nice things about CSS Grid is that even though this already is a lot simpler to lay out an item than many other solutions that we've been doing for decades in web development, we can still shorten this a lot. So I'm going to remove the grid row start and grid row end and just use grid row, which is a shorthand for grid row start and grid row end. And what it takes is the grid row start first, and then a slash, and then the grid row end. So that was the same thing as grid row start 1, grid row end 1. It's just a shorthand for it. Now we can do the same thing for grid column. We just delete what we had before, and voila, that is the exact same thing. So I'm just going to copy this down because it's going to be a very similar approach. I'll just change these to some different colors. Something like that. Right, so let's place this appropriately. So this will still be in this first row, but it will be in the second column and end in the third row, right? And we again need to target that appropriately. That is the header. So there we go. Now another thing we can do, since these are just filling up one grid area, we don't really need to say when to stop. We can just say fill up this one grid area. So we can even shorten this to just that. And same here. And same here. So that will be the exact same thing since we're only filling up one space. Now we can go down to nav, and we can say, okay, well, this is starting in the second row, and that's all it's going to be in. And it will be in the first column, right? Because it's all the way over to the left. So now we have our nav colored. Now, one thing you might notice is these things are touching. And one thing you might instinctually want to do is like set margin to like 10 pixels, right? Or set it all the way around. Now, this can cause a lot of problems for your design. You can get overflow, you can get compacting. I would say stay away from margin and padding here if you want just space between the grid areas. And what you can do instead is just say gap. And now all of our items will have a 10 pixel gap in between all of them. So that is, I mean, this is one of those very powerful, very simple things in CSS Grid is grid gap. So let's continue here. I think we're on content. So content will start in the second column, or the second row, excuse me, right, is the second thing down, and it will start and only take up the second column, right? So it's right there. So it's mapping to our design here. And let's go to footer. And footer will be in the third row, right? It's at the bottom of our 3-row grid. And for the grid column, now we want footer to not just be in this one spot, right? We want it to span the whole grid. So what we'll do is just the same as we did before, but we'll have it span 2. So this will start grid column start in 1 and grid column end in 3, or when it gets to 3. Another way to do this, and I think a more powerful way to do this if you want something to just sort of span to the end, is instead of explicitly stating what column to end at, you can say end at the end. So a -1 will be the same thing in this case. It will go all the way to the end. that's very useful for in the case of maybe you're coming back to a grid that you've laid out items on before, and the design spec has changed and you actually need one more column or one less column. Well, if you write it like this, this will always span to the end, right? From the beginning to the end. Cool. So that seems pretty good so far, but we can actually do a lot better. One thing we can do is we see here that this is only taking up this space and we have all this empty space. Well, I think for this design, we kind of want it to take up the entire screen, right? So we can see that our container's already taking up the whole screen, but because we've explicitly stated the size of these rows and columns, it's only taking up that size, since that size is available inside the entire container. So what we can instead use are fractional units. These are FRs. It's another kind of length unit in CSS. It's, I believe, specifically for grid. And the way it works is that one fractional unit, one FR, is just equal to one FR. It's relative to the other sizes in the in that line. So if I say 1FR, 5FR, 1FR, this will be the same relative sizing as 100 pixels to 500 pixels to 100 pixels, but because we're using fractional units, it will take up all of the available space. So we can do the same thing here. So we do 1FR and 6FR and save that, and now we're taking up the whole space. Now personally, I think it's a little bit crowded, so I'm going to reduce this down a little bit so we have a bit more space for our logo and our nav. But you can see that this is just a much nicer way of laying these out. You don't have to deal with calculating the right size pixels, different viewport sizes. It's always going to take up the same amount of relative space. Now there are instances where you might not want your nav to just get huge, and you can set a pixel size for that if you want in here, along with using FRs too. So one other thing we can do to start cleaning this up is, instead of having grid template rows and grid template columns, we can use something called grid template, which is another kind of shorthand. So grid template works just the same as grid template rows and grid template columns, but it can do it all in one line. So first you define your rows. So we can just do the same we were doing before, and then you slash, and then now you define your columns. So we have the same code as these two lines in one line. So we define our grid here. Now, one thing I want to point out is that I am using Firefox here, even though that is not my default browser. I'm a Chrome fanboy, but Firefox has, at least currently, the best grid layout inspector, I think, of any browser that I'm aware of. And what you can do is you can turn on the inspector and you can start displaying where your grid is. So now you know exactly where the grid lines are, the grid gap, as well as where the rows and columns are, right? They're all numbered here for you. So this is a really powerful tool, especially as you're laying things out in more complicated layouts, to see exactly where your grid is. Now we can do something that I think, if I had to pick one thing, is the coolest thing about CSS Grid, and that is what are called grid areas. So it's pretty remarkable. It's one of the coolest things I've seen in any kind of layout system. What you can do is you can use names of items in the grid as your layout. So we can just say grid template areas, and I'm going to just do this. I'm literally going to copy our design from over here and place it right in here. And what this is going to do is, now look, it will reference the template here. so it knows what the rows and columns are, or it would do it automatically if you are not explicitly stating it. It'll use the implicit grid. And it's saying logo should be in the top left. Header should be to the right of that. Nav should be second row, first column. Content should be second row, second column. And footer should be second row or third row, first column. So how we can start targeting this is, instead of explicitly saying where it should be placed, we can just say grid area logo. And we could do the same thing here. Grid area header. And the same thing all the way down the line. Area nav. Grid area content. Grid area footer. Let's make sure we got all of our syntax proper there. So we can save that. And I did something wrong. Footer, content, nav, header. What have I done? So the footer is there. Well, one thing I know we should do is that. There we go. So we were saying just go to that first, a third row, first column there. But what we actually want is the footer to go both, right? So there you go. We've defined our, we've said display grid. So we're going to use grid layout. We defined the grid template for the rows and columns. We've added a gap, and then we've defined our design here with words visually. And then all we've had to do is say what area these items are in. That's it. Pretty remarkable. So one thing I promised at the beginning was I would take a look at Flex, and where I think Flex and Grid play really nicely together is inside of a grid area to use Flex. So I'm going to show that off. There are other cases where you might want to have a grid inside of a Flex. Maybe you're laying out a bunch of images of like posts or something, like a Pinterest type thing. And there you might be using a grid inside of that container, and there might be Flex somewhere on the outside. But I'm going to show off a common use case. Before I do that, let me go right back to this areas and show you in Firefox, instead of displaying the numbers, I can display the names of the areas. I think that is really cool. So again, I highly recommend the Firefox Grid Inspector. If you're working on anything with grid layout, check it out in Firefox. So yeah, I'm going to just work on this logo here for a second and use Flex. So I'm going to take out the word logo, and this is now going to be a container for, like, let's say a logo and business name. So let's make a couple divs. Let's make 3. So we'll do like a logo, and here we'll do like business name, and then down here we'll do established 2020. And so now we got there. I'm going to take off the grid area names in our inspector here. And now we can see that those are just laid out inside this grid area with no styling, because I haven't styled this logo. But I'm going to use Flex. So I just do display Flex, and now they are flexed. Now the default flex direction is row. So this is implicit when you use Flex, that it will be in the direction of row. So if you think of grid as two-dimensional rows and columns, it helps to think of Flexbox as one-dimensional, so either row or column. So by default it is column, or it is row, excuse me, and I will change it to column, so it's going up and down. And then I'm going to center all of these things because I think that that would be nice. And it's also one of the very powerful things in Flexbox. Did I do that right? Justify content center. Oh, it's line items. There we go. So it is centered now. So yeah, that's great. We can go through and sort of style all the rest of the stuff with a mixture of grid and Flexbox, but we won't get into that in this episode. We might get into that in more in-depth, but this is just an intro episode. I'll leave with one other note, which is about the practical uses of grid in production. So not all browsers currently support grid. The grid spec's been out for a number of years now, but it is not fully supported in older browsers. So even though over 90% of browsers these days support the grid spec, not all of them do. So if you're working in production, one thing you should do is to do a media query on to make sure that the browser uses or can support grid. So you would just write grid 0, I believe, and wrap all of that. So now this styling will only get called if grid is supported, and we can just like change that. You can see we're not supporting this grid 12312 spec because it doesn't exist. So this browser doesn't support it. So that's one way that you can use it in production. It is a lot easier to write crisp layouts, as we saw here. These kinds of layouts would be a lot more difficult. Even something this simple would be a lot more lines of code, which leads to more likelihood of bugs. So grid is definitely valuable, but for safety's sake, to make sure that your users can actually see that kind of layout, write a feature query for grid. One other thing you might want to do is, as you see when we start shrinking this down, it would look really bad on mobile. So one way to solve for that would be to wrap this code down here in a media query to make sure that the screen size is large enough. And to do that, I need to write, well, I can just cheat. I think you need to do like the actual screen, but for this example, I'm not going to look up the syntax exactly. Another one there. So now this style will only apply if grid is supported and we are not on a device or a screen that is smaller than 768 or a view that's smaller. So you can see that grid is gone now because we shrunk it down below 768. So what you could do is here you would write like mobile design layout here, and whatever that is, and then up here you would do like on grid fallback here. So that way first a user would have whatever your non-grid fallback is for your design. So some kind of code that would give a similar layout by not using Grid. Then if the browser supports feature queries in Grid, you will get the Grid layout. And the first you will get is mobile. And then you will get let's call it desktop version of it. So progressive enhancement of the layout here. That's how you could do it in the real world. Another real world use case is prototyping. So as you saw, it was extremely quick and easy to create this and to change it, to change this entire layout. I mean, you could just play with the sizes here and get a different layout instead of going to each item and changing that around. It's very quick for prototyping. So if you are working on like a new product and you just need to get something up and running and to play around with until the design is right, this is a great way to do that. I'm sure the developers on the rest of your team that you're working with are going to be in browsers that support Grid. So yeah, that is it for this session. If you have any questions or comments, requests for other topics you'd like me to cover, just leave those in the comments. And thanks, and see you again soon.